Play by Murphy to go to the near side. Ahead for Lemieux. Takes a fucking stride against the man. Bellows cuts in on goal. Makes a little move. Hey! Shoots and scores!
When you look at the Pittsburgh Penguins, you see a team spoiled with riches and success. 5 Stanley Cups flooded over with generational talents and star players alike. One full of incredible bullshit. Random deep runs bailing out terrible situations and making rival franchises jealous with envy. Near-endless success that makes them one of the most decorated in recent memory. The pinnacle of modern hockey and legendary heritage. But things weren't always this ideal. The early years were like their live mascot, a penguin named Pete, skating around the ice, endearing to the fans, and quickly dying of pneumonia. Paying tribute to that poor bird, the Penguins were flightless and limp without a pulse. In 20 seasons, only 4 of them featured a winning record. Securing only 3 playoff victories and 9 trips in reverse swept out of the rest. One blatant tank later, a stork dropped a generational talent named Mario Lemieux on their doorstep. Things were not exactly magnifique afterward. They had missed the playoffs every year of Mario's young career. In 1987, years of perennial failure had led to a breaking point. A carousel of coaches rotating and none of them were all that effective. Bob Berry spent more time yelling at the circus performers on his team than he did winning. And the plug was pulled after 3 fruitless seasons. Penn's GM Eddie Johnston was in a bind. With the seat getting hot, he needed to hit with his next head coach and would scour the globe for him. This dilemma led him to talk with Serge Savard. As GM of the Canadiens, he had an ideal candidate. The man in charge of their AHL affiliate in Sherbrooke, Pierre Creamer. His resume was impeccable. An accomplished headman in every level of hockey he coached. One who's led his teams to championships. A sterling reputation with prospects and player development, emphasizing team discipline, physicality, and defensive positioning in his training, never playing favorites, and one who desired active communication with his players on and off the ice. Not to mention this would aid Mario in his blossoming as a more well-rounded player, a strong hire who only had one significant flaw. He couldn't speak English. Despite downplaying it, Creamer was going to a place about as French as New Delhi. Also consider that Pierre didn't know much about the Pens players he was going to coach. If he knew anything, he'd realize that only 4 players on the team were born in Quebec. So much for communication when you can barely speak the mother tongue. For example, after one practice, Pierre was incensed. He hated the players' lack of effort on the ice and wanted them to ride the exercise bikes. However, Creamer's English was notoriously mangled, especially when he was flustered. Therefore, his command came out as, "Go make bicycle." Obeying their coach's orders, the players drew a bike on a chalkboard and left. Knowing how Dan Quinn reacted to seeing him, I'm more surprised they didn't draw a picture of Fred Flintstone. Unfortunately, like his players, his coaching talent also scribbled on something and left. It may have had something to do with the whole foreign language thing, but time revealed the hire to be an outright disaster. His relationship with the players was as broken as his English. The rank and file on the team found Creamer to be aloof and arrogant at best. There were times he wouldn't even go into the locker room during intermissions. Most players simply went over his head if they wanted critique about their game, either going to assistant coach Rick Kehoe or Rick Lee, the head coach of the Muskegon Lumberjacks, the Penguins' minor league affiliate. There was even a private meeting with team executives as 5 key players on the team shared their grievances and suggestions, without Creamer or Johnston in attendance. The goal was playoffs or bust, and they were certainly busting at the seams. Frank Pietrangelo had 3 great games in October. Creamer had him demoted shortly after. Dan Frawley was a heart and soul player given the C by Pierre. Then stripped of it 2 months later when he was injured. Mario ended up becoming captain, so it ended up working out there. Unlike that, line changes were constant and baffling. In one case, he put defenseman Mo Mantha on the right wing. Another time, he put Bob Berry on Lemieux's line. Berry had been out the past 4 months for wrist surgery. Robbie Brown was constantly shelved despite being one of the better scorers on the team. Might be because Creamer saw him as a number 6 center. Why would it matter? After all, they're just forwards. Maybe he was resting them, unlike Lemieux. His game plan was pretty much to run him into the ground as he carried the team. There were plenty of times where Le Magnifique was logging over 30 minutes a night. And the Pens weren't without talent. It's not like they traded for Paul Coffey from Edmonton just for the sake of it. Eddie Johnston nearly swung a deal for Andy Moog at the deadline as well, but it was vetoed by ownership. Winning consistently was also vetoed by the league, as losing streaks would continually put them at the bottom of their division. The only constant was losing to the Flyers at the Spectrum, a fantastic tradition that Philly misses to this day. Despite all this and rumors of being fired for incompetence, Pierre was steadfast in his belief that he was doing right. After all, they were only a few points out of a playoff spot. All they had to do was beat the lowly New Jersey Devils, a team that hadn't made the playoffs in their pathetic existence. The Pens lost both games by a wide margin. Despite preaching team defense and structure, Pittsburgh was terrible in both those categories. Don't ask them to defend on the power play. Just score short-handed goals at will, you're fine. Yet, for whatever reason, this is not the end of their story. Pierre's piece de résistance was about to commence. Regardless of losses to Mickey Mouse organizations, Pittsburgh still had a chance to make the playoffs, but it required at least one loss by the Devils. Thanks to the previous 2 games, New Jersey had tiebreaker on them. In their penultimate game against Washington, mettle would be tested. As the game with the Capitals plays out, Pittsburgh would start out strong, roaring out with offensive might to a 5-3 lead in the second period. But you know the stereotype with this Pens team. Terrible defense and structure. They proceed to blow said lead. It morphs into a brutal back-and-forth affair with the game tied at 6. This is important because the Devils had beaten the Islanders earlier in the day. To stay alive, Pittsburgh needed to win. As the game headed into overtime, there was only one person in that arena who was unaware of that scenario. I'll give you a second to guess who that was. In the most damning testament to his coaching tenure, Pierre Creamer was playing for the die.
Die is gut, yes?
Despite the urgency of the situation, he wouldn't pull goalie Steve Gannett for an extra attacker. Players on the bench would be screaming at him to come in, only for Creamer to order him back into the net in a showing of tactical density. And this wasn't simply being flustered in the heat of the moment. He legitimately didn't know. Worse yet, he was adamant that the players were wrong about it. The Devils game was in the afternoon, Pierre. It flashed the damn result on the scoreboard in the first period. How the hell didn't you figure this out? As overtime dwindled, the Pens players were at a loss for words. Creamer was seemingly sabotaging their efforts due to sheer ignorance. And Mario himself got into an argument on the bench with Pierre about these tactics. In French. The rest of the team sat there in confusion. No one knows what was said, but thanks to his efforts and Eddie Johnston yelling at him on the phone, he agreed to pull the goalie eventually. But Mario didn't want to take any chances.
6-6 the score here in the third. Lead pass to Lemieux. Lemieux now coming down the left wing. Cuts for the net. Lemieux's in. His backhand shot. Score! Oh, stop the press! Mario Lemieux beats Bernard, and the Penguins win it 7-6.
Lemieux carrying the team on his back as always. This is legitimately one of the greatest goals in his career, yet you may have never seen it until now. You know why this is? New Jersey won their final game. The Penguins were eliminated, finishing dead last in the division yet again. Pierre would deny the transgressions against Washington happened, but it was obvious to anyone that this was an extremely poor fit. Creamer was horrifically overmatched, if only because English isn't his strong suit. The writing had long been on the wall, and was only reinforced once Tony Esposito was brought in as the new hockey czar. Pierre had been told to fuck off. He wasn't even seen at the NHL draft despite still being employed. Like the bicycle on a chalkboard, his tenure as Pens coach was erased. Bought out of his contract and exiled to life north of the border. In his final media scrum, Pierre fought his own Waterloo. He wasn't the problem. Players and media sabotaged his efforts at every turn. His quote, "Players are all the same. They want to find someone responsible. It's much easier to say that's the coach instead of saying it's me. They wanted to find a big dummy for not making the playoffs and they chose me. We had a good, positive year in Pittsburgh. We just missed the playoffs." This was a team that had missed the playoffs for 6 straight seasons. 16 of 21 teams made the playoffs in the 80s. No wonder why they cited communication issues as a reason for your dismissal. Did things get better in Pittsburgh immediately? No. Their next coach would be Gino Briaco, whose greatest achievement was being a childhood friend of Tony. He was so beloved that the team built a small tunnel to the bench so he could avoid being booed by fans. Players smelled a fraud and mutinied against him in short order, like trying to teach a shark table manners. As for our French-Canadian friend, Fred Flintstone went back to the place he felt comfortable. He mostly remained out of coaching hockey since that time, but he did return briefly to the QMJHL a few years later. In a much more ideal scenario as interim coach, Pierre won another championship with the Laval Titans. He resigned just before the next training camp in favor of work in Laval's Nature Center. Hey, it paid more and he didn't have to travel. You do the same thing. He'd eventually return as GM for Collège Français, but what that can't take away from him? Legendary heritage.